Smoke covered the ground like a silent ocean, and through it, a wounded soldier dragged his body forward. His arm was bleeding, his breath shallow, yet something inside him refused to stop. Every inch of the battlefield screamed pain, but his heart kept searching for what even he didn't know. Then, through the haze, a cry reached his ears. A man was calling for help. When the soldier looked closer, his heart froze. It was the same man who had once mocked him, laughed at his scars, questioned his courage. For a moment, time stopped. Rage, hurt, memory, all collided within him. But then, in the echo of that dying battlefield, something softer rose. He didn't see the man who mocked him anymore. He saw a human in need. And despite his wounds, he crawled toward him. Because some hearts are too brave to let hate win. His hand trembled as he reached the man lying before him. The same man who once looked down at him with contempt now looked up with eyes filled with fear. The battlefield was quiet, except for distant echoes of explosions fading into the horizon. The soldier could feel the sting of blood running down his arm, soaking through his sleeve, yet in that stillness, he felt something else rising. Strength born not from his muscles, but from the fire still burning inside his chest. The moment his hand touched the man's shoulder, everything that had once been heavy, the mockery, the humiliation, the loneliness, began to dissolve. Pain somehow turned into a strange kind of clarity. He realized something deep. A wound doesn't always mean you're broken. Sometimes it means you've been opened. Open to feel, to understand, to grow beyond what you once were. The wind carried the smell of dust and gunpowder. He looked at the trembling man and saw not an enemy, but a reflection of his own past weakness. That part of him that once sought validation, that once believed others' opinions could measure his worth. Now, lying on this field, bleeding yet breathing, he understood what true strength meant. It wasn't in shouting louder or fighting harder. It was in staying gentle when the world tried to harden you. The deeper the pain cut, the more clearly he saw that strength doesn't come from what you can control. It comes from what you choose to release. The anger, the resentment, the need to prove yourself right. Every wound he carried told us stories. Some were from battles against others, but most were from battles within himself. Wars fought in silence, against doubt, fear, and the temptation to give up. The soldier remembered nights of feeling invisible, nights when mockery burned worse than bullets. He had thought back then that pain was a punishment. But now, dragging this man through the dirt, he realized pain had always been a teacher. It was pain that showed him where he was fragile, where he needed to grow. Pain shaped him in ways comfort never could. He remembered the look on the mocker's face months ago. The smirk, the careless laugh, the way words were used like knives. He used to carry that memory like a wound that never healed. But now, as the man's weak voice whispered, "Help me," something shifted. The wound no longer hurt, it taught. It taught him that the cruelest words often come from the most fearful hearts. That mockery is not a measure of your weakness, but of someone else's struggle to understand your strength. He had been mocked not because he was small, but because his quiet persistence reflected what others lacked. The soldier tightened his grip, pulling the man closer to safety. His vision blurred for a moment, but not from exhaustion, from realization. All his life, he believed strength was about being unbroken. Now he understood, strength is about breaking and still moving forward. It's about bleeding and still choosing kindness. Every scar is not a reminder of loss, but proof that he endured, that he lived through moments that could have ended him. His wound was not a sign of weakness, it was a doorway to wisdom. He looked around at the destruction, at the fallen, at the smoke rising into the darkening sky. Every man there had fought for something: pride, revenge, loyalty. But as he dragged his body along, he realized he was no longer fighting against the world. He was fighting for the peace within himself, That peace came not from victory, but from understanding. You can lose everything, your strength, your status, even your hope. But as long as you still have compassion, you haven't truly lost. Compassion, he thought, is the last light a wounded soul carries. The man he helped began to weep quietly. Perhaps it was guilt. Perhaps it was relief. The soldier said nothing. He didn't need to. The act itself spoke more loudly than any words could. Every movement hurt. Every step sent pain shooting through his body. But each time he pulled the man forward, he felt lighter. It was as if every inch of kindness replaced a pound of bitterness. The wound on his arm still bled, but it no longer felt like suffering. It felt like purification. He realized that strength isn't what you show others. It's what you find when no one is watching. The strength to forgive when every part of you wants to hate. The strength to stand up after falling 100 times. The strength to look at the one who hurt you and still see a human being. That's the kind of power no weapon can destroy. That's the kind of victory no war can steal. He whispered to himself, almost as a prayer, "This wound is not my end." The words echoed inside his chest. His body was weak, but his soul stood taller than ever. Because true strength isn't in being untouched by life. It's in being touched deeply and still choosing to love. He understood now that every person carries a battlefield within them. The real war is not between nations or men. It's between who we are and who we can become after the pain. As he reached the edge of the trench, the horizon glowed faintly with dawn. The first light of morning brushed against his face, mixing with the blood and dust. He smiled faintly. Somewhere between the agony and the act of mercy, he had found meaning. That meaning was simple. The wound had not come to destroy him, but to show him who he truly was. He laid the man down gently and took a deep breath. The pain in his arm pulsed, but he didn't hide from it anymore. It was his proof that he had faced darkness and still chosen light. The man beside him looked at him with disbelief, maybe even shame, but the soldier just nodded softly. No revenge, no bitterness, just calm. And as the morning sun rose over the battlefield, the wounded soldier finally understood. Strength is not what survives the storm. Strength is what forgives in the middle of it. The morning light stretched slowly across the torn earth, casting long shadows over the fallen. The wounded soldier sat still for a moment, his chest rising and falling with slow, deliberate breaths. The warmth of the sun touched his skin, but inside him, an older coldness began to thaw. The kind that had lived there since the day mockery first entered his life. As the man he had just saved coughed weakly beside him, a memory flickered like a haunting echo. The moment those same lips had once laughed at his pain. That laughter had cut deeper than any weapon. It had turned every heartbeat into a reminder that sometimes the cruelest battles aren't fought with guns, but with words. He had carried that moment through sleepless nights, through endless drills, through the quiet agony of wanting to prove himself. There was a time when every insult replayed in his mind like a broken record. "War, you're too weak. You're not made for this." Those words became invisible chains, and even though his body had marched on, his spirit had limped behind. But today, sitting here beside the man who had once wounded him with ridicule, he felt something shift. He realized that the weight of mockery only lives as long as you let it live inside you. He looked at the man's face, pale, frightened, trembling, and wondered how something once so powerful in his mind now looked so small. The same man who had laughed at him, who had made him question his worth, now needed his strength to survive. Life had a strange way of folding lessons into moments of pain. The soldier didn't smile. He didn't speak. He just watched, breathing slowly, realizing that he no longer hated him. The hate had burned itself out, and in its ashes, understanding had taken root. Mockery, he thought, doesn't always come from cruelty. Sometimes it comes from fear. People mock what they don't understand. They ridicule what they secretly wish they had the courage to face. That man's laughter had never truly been about him. It had been about the other man's own weakness. The soldier had been too blind to see it then. But now, after blood and battle, it made perfect sense. Pain had become his teacher, and this moment was the final lesson. That mockery only hurts when you give it the power to. He remembered the days after that humiliation, how he had trained longer, harder, desperate to silence that echo in his head. But the more he chased approval, the further peace ran from him. The truth was, no amount of proving could heal a wound made by someone else's insecurity. You can't silence another's mockery by shouting louder. You silence it by growing quieter, by knowing yourself so deeply that no voice outside can shake you. He realized it now. The real fight had never been to prove his strength to others, but to remember it for himself. The wounded man stirred beside him, whispering something barely audible, an apology tangled in the wind. The soldier didn't reply, not because he was cold, but because forgiveness didn't need words. Forgiveness lived in action, and he had already done the only thing that mattered. He had helped him. That single act had spoken louder than any apology could. Sometimes, silence heals what speech only reopens. He looked out over the horizon, at the orange streaks of dawn cutting through the fading smoke. For the first time in a long time, he felt free. Not because the battle had ended, but because the war inside him finally had. All those years he had thought strength meant holding on to pain, remembering every insult, wearing them like armor. But true armor, he now understood, was made of peace. The kind of peace that comes when you no longer let others define who you are. As the man beside him cried softly, the soldier felt a deep compassion rise within him. Not pity, not superiority, just understanding. He saw in that man the same confusion he had once carried, and that recognition brought a kind of quiet mercy to his heart. Maybe the man mocked him because he had seen a mirror, someone who reflected the parts of himself he couldn't face. Maybe cruelty is just pain's disguise, trying to hide its own wounds by opening others. The soldier reached for his canteen and placed it gently in the man's shaking hands. "Drink," he said softly. His voice was tired but steady. The man hesitated, eyes wide, guilt etched across his face. The soldier nodded again, wordless but clear. There was no accusation in his gaze, no triumph, only stillness. He had nothing left to prove, nothing left to defend. The man drank, tears mixing with dust on his face, and the soldier turned his eyes back to the horizon. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was healing. The sun continued to rise, and the soldier realized that light doesn't argue with darkness. It simply replaces it. That's what forgiveness does. It doesn't excuse the hurt. It just refuses to let the hurt rule your heart anymore. He thought about all the times he had replayed that old laughter, how much power he had given it, how it had shaped his choices, his fears, his self-image. And now, sitting beside the same man, he realized something profound. Mockery loses its voice when you stop listening to it. The laughter that once haunted him now sounded small, distant, almost meaningless. The words that once pierced him now felt like echoes from another lifetime. The soldier took a deep breath and whispered, almost to himself, "You never broke me. You only showed me where I was meant to grow." His voice carried softly into the air, not as a declaration but as a truth discovered through pain. Every insult, every laugh, every doubt had been a chisel shaping the man he had become. He stood slowly, pain still throbbing through his body, but his steps felt lighter. He turned once more to the man he had saved, not to see gratitude, not to see guilt, but to see a soul learning, just as he had once learned. Then he walked away, each step dissolving the weight of old memories. Behind him, the battlefield began to quiet, and the sound of the wind carried a strange peace, as if the earth itself was exhaling. The soldier realized that mockery, pain, and wounds are all part of the same journey. They come to test whether your heart will close or open. He had chosen to keep his open. And that single choice, he knew now, was what made him truly strong. He walked slowly, the ground beneath him cracked and silent. The air still carried the scent of smoke and gunpowder, but his heart was calmer than it had been in years. Behind him lay the man he had saved, the same man who once mocked him, the same man whose words had lived like splinters inside his soul. Yet now, as he moved forward through the broken earth, there was no bitterness left in his chest, just a quiet ache, a strange peace. But peace doesn't come without a test, and his test was waiting just a few steps ahead. He stopped when he heard another faint cry for help. The sound came from a ditch, shallow but filled with debris. For a moment he thought he was imagining it, the mind playing tricks after too much pain, too much loss. But the cry came again, weaker this time. He turned toward it, and his breath caught. It was another man, not his enemy, not his friend, but a soldier from the opposite side. The enemy. His hand instinctively tightened on the rifle slung across his shoulder. Every instinct in him screamed caution. Every scar he carried whispered warning. But another voice, softer, deeper, asked him a question. Will you stop being human just because someone once stopped being kind? He stood there, staring down at the injured man. The enemy's uniform was torn, his face pale, his lips trembling as he reached out weakly. The soldier's heart pounded in his chest. A storm began to rise inside him. Part fury, part compassion, part confusion. The war outside had ended, but inside, another had just begun. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about the war between revenge and compassion. The hardest war a human ever fights. He looked at the man's face and saw fear. The same fear he had once felt when he was the one lying helpless. For a moment, anger tried to take over. His mind whispered, "Why should you help him? He wouldn't help you." He'd pull the trigger without hesitation if the roles were reversed. The memories of betrayal, the sting of mockery, the humiliation, they all surged like a wave, trying to drown the calm he had just found. His jaw clenched. His breath grew heavier. His body wanted to walk away. But something deeper wouldn't let him move. The soldier knelt slowly, torn between two worlds. The world that demanded vengeance and the world that begged for compassion. His heart thudded like a drum. He stared at his hands, scarred, shaking, unsure what to do. One choice would feel like justice. The other would feel like love. One would satisfy his pride. The other would heal his soul. And that's when he realized the true war was never on the battlefield. It had always been inside him. He closed his eyes. The laughter of his mocker echoed faintly in his memory, blending with the cries of the dying around him. Every insult, every betrayal, every reason to hate replayed itself like ghosts demanding his loyalty. But then, in the middle of that noise, he heard something quieter. His own heartbeat, steady, relentless, human. He opened his eyes again, and for the first time he saw the enemy differently. Not as a monster, not as a threat, but as another man, wounded, scared, lost. Just like him, he took a deep breath and made his choice. He lowered his rifle to the ground. Every ounce of hatred he had carried began to dissolve the moment his hand reached out toward the fallen man. His fingers brushed against the enemy's arm, and a strange warmth spread through him. Not the warmth of victory, but of release. For years he had fought for survival. But now, in helping someone who didn't deserve his mercy, he was finally learning to live. The enemy looked up at him, confusion written all over his face. His lips trembled as he whispered, "Why?" The soldier didn't answer. He didn't need to. There are moments when words would only ruin what silence can make sacred. His actions spoke everything. That even when the world divides, humanity can still unite. That even when life tries to turn you cold, you can choose to stay warm. He tore a strip from his own uniform and wrapped it around the man's bleeding leg. The blood seeped through the fabric quickly, staining his hands. But he didn't flinch. He pressed harder, steady, focused. The sun above them began to rise higher, spilling light across their faces. It felt like the world itself was watching this quiet war of choice. A war without weapons, fought in silence, won through compassion. The soldier lifted the man slowly, helping him lean against a broken wall. His own wound pulsed with pain, but he didn't stop. The more he helped, the lighter he felt. It was as if forgiveness was being pulled out of his soul, thread by thread, woven into something new. The voice inside him, the one that had always demanded revenge, finally grew quiet. What replaced it was a steady calm, an understanding that kindness is not weakness. It's courage in its purest form. He looked at the man once more, meeting his eyes. In that look, there was no victory, no superiority, only truth. They were both human, both wounded, both tired of hate. And for the first time, the soldier realized that compassion doesn't erase pain, it transforms it. The hurt remains, but it stops being poison. It becomes purpose. He stood again, the wind brushing softly against his face. The battlefield around him was still and vast, yet for the first time, he didn't feel small in it. He felt larger than the war, larger than his past, larger than the pain that once controlled him, because he had made a choice, the kind of choice that separates the broken from the brave. As he began to walk once more, leaving behind both the mocker and the enemy, a simple truth echoed inside him. The heart is the only battlefield that truly matters, and those who win it don't conquer others. They conquer themselves. He walked away slowly, his steps uneven but steady, every movement heavy with pain and purpose. The world around him was still quiet, the air thick with the aftertaste of war. The sun climbed higher, but its warmth couldn't quite reach his skin. It was the kind of morning that felt both alive and hollow. He could still feel the weight of the man he had just helped, an enemy who now rested in safety because he chose compassion over revenge. And though his body ached, something inside him had become lighter. There was peace in his pain, as if life itself had just whispered, "Now you understand." But understanding does not come without reflection. Every step he took echoed the question that now burned inside him. What truly defines a man? He had seen soldiers who could destroy anything in their path, but couldn't control the rage within their own hearts. He had seen men with medals pinned to their chests yet chained by bitterness that no glory could hide. And now, he understood that the real measure of a man was not how much power he could wield, but how much grace he could hold in moments when power was useless. He reached a patch of ground untouched by explosions, where the grass still stood tall, swaying gently in the breeze. He sat down, exhaustion pulling him closer to the earth, his palms pressing into the soil. He looked at his hands. Hands that had held weapons, lifted the wounded, touched death and chosen mercy. These were not the hands of a perfect man, but a one who had learned what humanity truly meant. His whole life, he had believed that courage was about facing bullets and surviving battlefields. But now he saw that courage was quieter. It was the strength to do good when the world gave you every reason not to. He remembered his younger self, standing in line during training, trying so hard to appear strong, desperate for recognition. Back then, strength meant winning, proving, conquering. But after everything he had lived through, those words had lost their shine. Winning wasn't about standing taller than others. It was about standing firm within yourself. Proving didn't mean silencing others. It meant staying true to your values even when the world laughed at them. And conquering didn't mean defeating people. It meant defeating the anger, fear, and pride that lived inside your own chest. He closed his eyes and let the memories come. The laughter of the man who had mocked him, the terror in the eyes of the enemy he had saved. the silence that followed when he walked away from them both. It all merged into a single thread that tied his past to this moment. Each scene reminded him that the hardest choices are the ones that shape who you truly are. The world may not see those choices. No crowd will ever cheer for them. But they become the invisible victories that build your soul. A soft wind moved through the field, carrying with it the smell of burnt metal and soil. He could hear faint birds in the distance, cautious, as if unsure whether the war had truly ended. That fragile sound reminded him that life always finds its way through ruin. Maybe that's what he was doing now, growing again, through the ashes of everything that had tried to break him. He thought of the men who would never see this sunrise, the ones who fought with hate in their hearts and never found peace, the ones who thought strength came from the noise of victory rather than the silence of understanding. He whispered for them, not in sadness, but in acknowledgement, because he now knew what they never did, that every man faces a moment when he must decide what kind of soul he will carry for the rest of his life. The soldier tilted his head to the sky, squinting against the light. He smiled faintly. For the first time in years, it wasn't the smile of someone who had survived, but of someone who had finally chosen how to live. In that quiet field, he realized that the choice to help, to forgive, to stay human when everything around you tells you not to, that is the choice that defines a man. He slowly lifted his gaze to the horizon, where the sun was melting into gold. The pain in his arm pulsed, steady and familiar, but he didn't hide from it anymore. Pain had become his compass. It reminded him that he still felt, still cared, still belonged to life. He knew he would carry his wounds forever, but not as burdens. They were symbols, marks of the moments when he chose humanity over hatred. As he rose to his feet again, the world seemed quieter, clearer. He could hear his own heartbeat blending with the wind, a rhythm of life and resilience. He realized that every man eventually faces two paths, one that feeds the ego and one that nourishes the soul. The first is easy, loud, temporary. The second is hard, silent, eternal. Today, he had walked the second path. He began to move forward again, one slow step at a time, his shadow stretching long behind him. He didn't know where he was going, perhaps back to his unit, perhaps nowhere at all. But for the first time, he didn't need direction to feel whole. The decision he had made had already rewritten his destiny. Because what defines a man is not the battles he wins, but the battles he refuses to fight, the ones inside him that demand anger, pride, revenge. The sun was bright now, painting his silhouette across the ground. His uniform was torn, his skin bruised, but his spirit stood tall. He had faced cruelty and met it with kindness. He had carried pain and turned it into purpose. And somewhere deep inside, he felt something unshakable awaken. A quiet knowing that this is what true victory looks like. He looked back once more, just for a second. The field was still, the smoke now distant. Everything he had been through, the hurt, the laughter, the war, had led him to this single truth. A man is not remembered by how loud he roared, but by how softly he healed. And as he walked into the distance, with the weight of the world finally off his shoulders, he understood that his choice wasn't just an act of mercy. It was his rebirth. Because in helping others, he had saved the only thing that ever truly mattered, his own soul. The road stretched endlessly ahead, quiet and golden under the morning light. Each step the soldier took felt lighter, yet deeper, as if the ground itself was whispering that something within him had shifted forever. The pain in his arm was still there, but it no longer screamed. It spoke. It spoke of endurance, of survival, of meaning. He had learned that real strength was not in striking back, but in staying kind when cruelty would have been easier. The choice he made earlier, the act of mercy that had cost him his pride but restored his soul, began to unfold its true purpose within him. He realized that what he had done wasn't just about saving another man's life. It was about freeing his own heart. He stopped near a small stream, the water glinting under the rising sun, and looked down at his reflection. The face staring back wasn't the same one that had entered the war. The lines were deeper, the eyes quieter, yet somehow fuller, like they had seen the worst of humanity and still chosen to believe in its light. He touched the water gently, watching the ripples distort his reflection. That's when it struck him. This is what forgiveness does. It doesn't erase what happened, it simply softens the image. It allows you to see the wound without reliving it. For so long, he had thought forgiveness was weakness, a surrender of pride. But now he saw it for what it truly was, a victory no one else could take from him. Forgiveness was not saying, "You were right." It was saying, "You no longer control me." It was the quiet reclaiming of his peace, the moment he stopped being defined by the cruelty of others. In that realization, something broke open inside him. Something old, heavy, and long overdue to be released. He sat by the stream, the gentle sound of water soothing the silence. His memories began to unfold again. The man who mocked him, the enemy he saved, the fear that once ruled him. But this time, they didn't bring pain. They brought understanding. Each one of them had been a teacher disguised as an enemy. Each act of hurt had pushed him closer to discovering who he really was beneath all the armor, beneath the rage, beneath the need to prove himself. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't something he gave others. It was something he gave himself. He closed his eyes and remembered the face of the man who had humiliated him. He could still hear the laughter, but it no longer echoed like thunder. It sounded distant now, almost faint, like a voice carried away by the wind. That was the power of forgiveness. It silenced the noise. He felt no hatred, no anger, no desire to rewrite what had already happened. The past remained, but it no longer held his heart hostage. For the first time, he could breathe without the weight of yesterday pressing on his chest. The soldier looked up and saw the birds returning to the sky, their wings slicing through the light. He smiled faintly. "You're free," he whispered, not to them, but to himself. That single act of mercy had unlocked a part of him that war could never touch. Forgiveness had become his shield, not his weakness. It had turned him into something no bullet could break. A man at peace with himself. He stood again, feeling the breeze move through his torn uniform. Every scar, every bruise, every mark of survival had become sacred to him now. They weren't symbols of suffering anymore. They were proof of transformation. Each one told a story of how he had chosen love over hate, calm over chaos. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that forgiveness wasn't an end. It was a beginning. It wasn't about forgetting what people did. It was about remembering who you are despite what they did. As he began to walk again, he felt the world around him respond. The wind no longer bit at his skin. It brushed against him softly, almost as if it was acknowledging his strength. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt peaceful, like a companion that finally understood him. In that moment, he knew that forgiveness is not just for others. It's the gift that restores your humanity when life tries to steal it away. He recalled how easy it would have been to hate. Hatred burns fast, fierce, and bright. It makes you feel alive, powerful, justified. But it leaves behind ashes, and those ashes bury the heart. Forgiveness, on the other hand, is quiet. It doesn't demand applause. It doesn't roar. It whispers, "Let it go." And when you do, you find that the world becomes lighter, not because it has changed, but because you have. The soldier remembered the faces of those he had lost. Some to battle, some to bitterness. He thought of all the men who would never find this peace, men who would carry their pain like armor until it became their grave. He wished they could feel what he was feeling now, the liberation that comes from simply deciding not to hate anymore. He wished they could understand that forgiveness isn't for the other person. It's for the part of yourself that deserves rest. He reached a ridge overlooking the valley below. The world stretched wide and endless, bathed in sunlight. He stood there, silent, letting the view wash over him. Every piece of earth below had seen pain, yet it still bloomed. That's what forgiveness does. It allows beauty to grow in the places where pain once lived. He exhaled deeply, as if releasing every ghost that had ever haunted him. His shoulders relaxed, and for the first time, he didn't feel like a soldier anymore. He felt like a man reborn from the ashes of his own battles. The war within him had ended, not because he had won, but because he had stopped fighting. He looked to the sky, eyes glimmering under the sunlight, and whispered softly, "Forgiveness is my freedom." The words weren't dramatic. They were truth. He realized that anyone can be brave enough to fight, but very few are brave enough to forgive. And in that moment, he knew the world may never remember his name, but it would carry the echo of his choice. Because forgiveness, he understood now, is the only victory that never fades. He stood there on that ridge, the wind brushing against his skin, carrying the scent of dust and distance. The words he had just whispered, "Forgiveness is my freedom," still echoed in his chest, not as a statement, but as a pulse. It was the first time in years that silence didn't feel like a wound. For so long, every quiet moment had been a battlefield of its own, haunted by voices of regret, by memories that refused to fade. But now, that silence felt sacred. It felt like the earth was finally breathing with him. As he began to descend from the ridge, the soldier felt something new, an awareness he couldn't name. Every step he took seemed to draw him deeper into himself. He was no longer walking through war. He was walking through memory, through lessons, through the ashes of everything he once was. The war outside had ended, but inside he could still hear echoes, faint, distant reminders of fear, pride, and pain. Yet with each breath, those echoes softened, melting into something gentler, almost tender. He remembered the faces he had met, the man he forgave, the soldiers he had fought beside, the ones he had lost. Their eyes, their voices, their pain, they had all left something inside him. Before, he had thought those memories were weights, burdens he'd have to carry forever. But now he realized they were seeds. Each one had planted something within him: compassion, understanding, the quiet strength that comes not from power, but from peace. He reached a small, broken tree at the edge of the valley. Its trunk was split in half, but one side was still alive, reaching toward the sky. He placed his hand on it gently, feeling the texture of its bark, rough, scarred, surviving. In that simple moment, he saw himself reflected in that tree. Broken, yes, but still growing, still reaching, still alive. That's when he understood something he had never seen before. Sometimes, life doesn't heal you back to who you were. It heals you into someone new. He sat beneath the tree, letting the warmth of the sun seep into his tired bones. A single thought crossed his mind. How strange it is that pain can be a teacher. He used to hate it, to run from it, to bury it beneath silence and duty. But now, he saw pain for what it truly was: a messenger. It doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to shape you, to break open the parts of you that have forgotten how to feel. Every wound, every loss, every heartbreak had been carving space within him for something greater to enter. He thought of the man he saved, the one who once mocked him. He wondered where he was now, whether he had lived, whether he ever thought of that moment. Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But that didn't matter anymore. The act wasn't about being remembered. It was about remembering himself. Forgiving that man had been the first step toward forgiving his own heart for all the ways it had once hardened. Because the truth was, he had mocked himself too. Every time he doubted his worth, every time he let bitterness win. And saving that man had been his way of saving the part of himself that still believed in kindness, even when the world didn't deserve it. The breeze picked up again, carrying with it a calmness that felt almost divine. The soldier closed his eyes, and for the first time, he prayed. Not to any god, but to life itself. He prayed for understanding, for stillness, for the courage to keep walking even when the path ahead seemed invisible. In that prayer, he found something that had eluded him for years. A quiet kind of peace, the kind that doesn't depend on victories or applause. The kind that comes from surrender, not defeat. He looked up and watched the clouds drift lazily across the sky, their movements slow, effortless, free. That's what he wanted. To move like that. To live without resistance, without fear of what had been, or what was yet to come. He understood now that real strength wasn't about standing tall. It was about staying open. It was about letting life touch you, even when it hurts. Because every time it hurts, it's shaping you into something softer, wiser, more real. He rose again, brushing the dust from his uniform, and began to walk toward the horizon. The light ahead was warm, almost golden, and he followed it without hesitation. Each step felt like forgiveness in motion. Gentle, steady, certain. And though the battlefield was long behind him, he carried its lessons within him like sacred fire. He no longer feared pain. He no longer ran from memory, because he had seen what pain could turn into if you let it. Compassion. As he walked, he thought about how the world teaches us to fight, to defend, to win. But nobody teaches us how to heal. Nobody tells you that healing takes more courage than war ever will. Healing demands you to face yourself, to look at your scars, your guilt, your regrets, and still choose to love who you've become. That's what he was learning now. Healing wasn't about going back. It was about moving forward, carrying the wisdom of every wound like a lantern in the dark. The valley stretched endlessly before him, glowing in the last light of the day. He stopped for a moment and turned around. Behind him lay the path of his past, the pain, the choices, the forgiveness. Ahead of him was the unknown, wide and open. But for once, he wasn't afraid of the unknown. He smiled faintly, whispering into the quiet, "Whatever comes next, I am ready." It wasn't a declaration of victory. It was an acceptance of life as it was, imperfect, uncertain, beautiful. He had walked through hate, through suffering, through loss, and found the quiet truth at the center of it all. Life will wound you, yes, but it will also heal you, if you let it. As he disappeared into the horizon, the sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of fire and peace. The war was over. The pain had spoken, and now only the silence remained, soft, sacred, and alive. In that silence, the soldier walked on, not as a fighter, but as a man reborn. Proof that even the most wounded hearts can still learn how to love again. The sun had already begun to fall behind the mountains, the sky bleeding into hues of orange and deep violet. The soldier walked on, his shadow long and thin, stretching before him like a silent companion. He didn't know where the path led anymore, and for the first time in his life, he didn't need to. The need for direction, for control, for certainty, it had all burned away somewhere between the pain he endured and the peace he found. What remained was something quieter, something he couldn't name, but he could feel it, like a steady pulse deep in his chest, guiding him without words. He kept walking until the golden light turned to twilight, and the first stars began to appear. The world around him had changed. It wasn't just the landscape. It was his eyes that saw differently. What once seemed cold and cruel now looked gentle, alive. The wind that once stung his face now felt like a soft reminder that he was still here, alive, breathing, whole. As he walked, his mind drifted to the countless nights he had once spent awake. Nights where silence was louder than war. Nights where the weight of everything he'd seen pressed so heavily on his chest that he thought he'd never rise again. He remembered how he used to drown in guilt for things beyond his control, how he carried the pain of others as if it were his own. But now, something had shifted. The guilt had loosened its grip. He had realized that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about forgiving yourself for not knowing better at the time. It was about understanding that you can't save everyone, but you can choose to save yourself. He stopped for a moment, the cool air filling his lungs. Above him, the stars blinked softly, scattered like distant campfires across the dark. He smiled faintly. Those tiny lights reminded him of the men he'd fought beside, souls who had once shared laughter, fear, and courage under the same sky. Many of them were gone now, but somehow he didn't feel alone. He could still feel their presence, not as ghosts, but as echoes of lessons they left behind. Each one had taught him something about humanity, about the fragile beauty of it all. He realized then that survival wasn't just about keeping your body alive. It was about keeping your heart open, even when the world tried to close it. And that's what this journey had become, not a path to escape the past, but a path to open himself fully to the present. He no longer feared pain, he honored it. Pain had become his teacher, his reminder that he was still capable of feeling deeply. Because a numb life, he knew now, was worse than any wound. As he walked, he came upon a small, deserted village, a place left behind by time. Crumbled walls, burnt wood, broken fences. It was silent, yet it spoke to him. Every ruin carried a memory. Every brick, every piece of ash, whispered a story of someone who once lived, loved, and lost here. He stepped carefully among the remains, his boots crunching softly against the ground, and he felt a strange tenderness rise in his chest. This was the truth of life, he thought. It builds, it burns, it rebuilds again. Everything is temporary, yet nothing is wasted. Even ruins have their meaning. He knelt beside a broken well, brushing away the dust from its edge. Inside, he saw his reflection again, faint and distorted by darkness. For a long moment, he just stared. The face staring back wasn't the same man who entered the war. It wasn't even the same man who crawled across the battlefield to save the one who mocked him. This face was calm. Tired, yes, but peaceful. There was something sacred in that exhaustion, the kind that comes only after surrendering everything you once thought you needed. And in that stillness, he understood something deeper than before. Peace isn't something you find. It's something you become. It's not waiting for the world to calm down. It's realizing that calmness begins inside you. The world will always have storms. People will always wound and misunderstand and leave. But if you learn to hold stillness within, no storm can drown you. He sat beside the well for a while, his hands resting on his knees. The night growing darker around him, he listened, to the wind, to the rustling of leaves, to the rhythm of his own breath. It was all so fragile, so fleeting, yet so perfectly enough. For years he had chased strength as if it were something outside of him, hidden in victory or discipline or endurance. But now, he saw that true strength was quiet. It lived in gentleness, in patience, in the ability to still love after everything had fallen apart. The soldier lifted his eyes again to the sky. The stars looked closer now, brighter. He thought about how every one of them was born from destruction, from chaos, from collapse. Maybe people were the same. Maybe light, too, is born from the ruins of what once burned. That thought stayed with him, wrapping around him like a blanket. For the first time, the darkness didn't feel empty. It felt alive, with memory, with forgiveness, with new beginnings. He rose slowly and began to walk again. His steps were unhurried, his movements calm. Each step felt like a prayer not for more days, but for more meaning in the ones he had. He wasn't searching anymore, he was simply living. And in that simple act of being, he found the kind of peace that no war could ever steal. As he reached the end of the village, he turned back one last time. The moonlight fell softly across the broken walls, and for a moment they looked almost beautiful. Even in ruin there was grace. Even in endings there was light. He whispered softly into the wind, "Everything that hurt me taught me." The words left his lips like a promise. not to anyone else, but to his own soul. He didn't need to be whole to be worthy. He didn't need to be unscarred to be at peace. He only needed to be honest with his pain, his growth, his heart. As he walked on into the night, the world seemed to walk with him. The stars followed his path, the earth hummed beneath his feet, and somewhere deep within, he knew, the journey was no longer about finding peace. It was about becoming it. And in that quiet knowing, he smiled. Because even a wounded heart, once it chooses love again, can light up the darkest night. The night deepened, and the air turned colder, yet the soldier walked on, his steps steady, guided by something unseen. The stars shimmered above him like silent witnesses to his transformation. Every breath he took now felt sacred, like an exchange between him and the universe. A promise that he would never again live half alive. The words he had whispered, even a wounded heart can light up the darkest night, still lingered around him, echoing softly through the silence. He didn't know how far he had come, nor did he care. His journey was no longer measured in miles, but in moments of awareness, in the way he could now see beauty even in brokenness. Each scar on his body had become a map, leading him not back to who he once was, but forward to who he was meant to be. The pain that had once consumed him now glowed quietly within, like embers that refused to die. And those embers, he realized, were not reminders of suffering. They were proof of survival. As dawn began to bleed into the horizon, he reached a field of wildflowers growing through cracked soil. Their colors were soft, fragile, but they swayed boldly against the morning breeze. He stopped and looked at them. Small, delicate things, rising where no life should. And it hit him with a quiet clarity. Healing is exactly like this. It doesn't happen in perfect places. It blooms through the cracks, through the dirt, through everything that was once broken. That's what made it real. He knelt down and touched one of the flowers, its petals trembling under his fingers. For a long time, he stayed there, not speaking, just feeling. The earth beneath his palm, the warmth of the sunlight returning to his skin, the whisper of wind brushing against his cheek. It was all so simple, and yet it carried more meaning than any battle he had ever fought. This was life in its truest form. Quiet, humble, resilient. And for the first time, he didn't feel separate from it. He felt part of it. He thought of everything that had brought him here. The mockery, the wounds, the long nights of fear and guilt. He thought of how easily he could have turned bitter, how close he had come to letting hatred shape him. But he hadn't. Somewhere deep inside, a small light had refused to go out. And that light, fragile as it was, had saved him. He smiled faintly, realizing that the man who once mocked him was no longer his enemy. The war, the pain, the past, none of it held power over him anymore. The only battle left was the one within, and he had finally laid down his weapons. Forgiveness had not only freed him, it had transformed him. It had taught him that peace was not the absence of pain. It was the acceptance of it. He rose again and began walking through the field, the flowers brushing against his legs as he passed. The air smelled of morning, clean, alive, full of possibility. For so long, he had lived in survival mode, waiting for life to show him kindness. But now he understood that kindness was something he had to become. He couldn't wait for the world to change. He had to be the one who changed how he saw it. He remembered the faces of strangers he had met along his path. People who were also carrying invisible wounds. Some hid them behind laughter, some behind anger, some behind silence. And he realized how easy it was to judge, to assume, to overlook the quiet wars others were fighting inside. That thought softened him even more. It made him vow that wherever he went next, he would walk gently, because everyone in their own way was bleeding. He found a small hill and climbed to its top, where he could see the valley stretching endlessly beneath him. The light had fully returned now, golden and warm, painting everything in a soft glow. It was the same land that had once witnessed his pain, but it looked different now. Maybe it hadn't changed at all. Maybe it was his eyes that finally learned to see the light beyond the shadows. He sat there for a while, watching the sunrise. Each ray of light felt like forgiveness in motion, soft, patient, unconditional. And as the warmth touched his face, he felt tears slip down his cheeks, quiet and unforced. They weren't tears of sadness anymore. They were release, the body's final way of letting go. He whispered softly, "I made it." Not as a boast, not as a cry of victory, but as a gentle acknowledgement that he had survived himself, that he had walked through darkness without losing his soul, that even when everything around him had fallen apart, he had chosen to rebuild. Not with walls, but with openness. The wind carried his words across the field, and in that moment, he felt the weight of the world lift. Everything he had once resisted, pain, loss, uncertainty, now felt like part of something greater. The chaos, the heartbreak, the fear, they had all been chapters of his becoming. Nothing had been wasted. He realized then that life doesn't reward the strongest. It rewards the ones who stay soft, the ones who keep showing up even when it hurts, the ones who keep believing even after being broken. Strength isn't in how loud you roar, it's in how quietly you rise after you've fallen. As he stood up, the sun fully broke over the horizon, flooding the land with light. He closed his eyes and let it wash over him, breathing deeply, letting every memory dissolve into warmth. The soldier no longer felt like a soldier. The war was gone, both outside and within. He took one last look at the field, at the flowers that bloomed through the cracks, and smiled. That's what he had become, a living testament to the beauty that can rise from ruin. And as he walked forward, each step felt lighter, freer, more alive. He didn't look back again. He didn't need to. The past had already served its purpose. What mattered now was the road ahead, open, uncertain, beautiful. The journey had changed him, but more importantly, it had awakened him. The soldier walked into the new morning, his heart unarmed, his spirit whole. The world felt vast, but he felt ready, because he finally understood the truth. The greatest victories are not the ones won on battlefields, but the quiet ones fought within the soul. And in that silent triumph, he was finally home. The sun stood high now, bathing everything in gold. The soldier walked along a narrow dirt path, his shadow following softly behind. There was no destination, no war, no fear. Just the rhythm of his breath and the quiet hum of life around him. Every scar on his skin had turned into a story, every wound into wisdom. He no longer carried the past as a weight, but as a light that guided him forward. He realized that sometimes the ones most wounded become the ones who heal others, because they understand pain too deeply to let it win. As he reached the edge of the horizon, the wind wrapped around him like an old friend. He stopped, smiled faintly, and whispered to the sky. It was never about the battle. It was about becoming whole. And with that, he walked on, not as a soldier anymore, but as a man reborn from forgiveness, carrying peace like a flame that would never die.